For 300 years that wolf refused every hand, until she breathed its true name and wept. The last time Werk answered to a human voice, my grandfather's grandfather was still learning to walk. That is what the old records say, and for most of my reign I dismissed the old records as the sentimental hobby of men who had too much time and not enough war to occupy them. I was wrong about many things in those early years. I was wrong about the records. I was wrong about the council's reforms. And I was most grievously, most unforgivably wrong about her, about the quiet woman in the cottage at the edge of the grey wood, who had spent 6 years tending scrolls no one asked her to tend, speaking softly to a wolf no one else dared approach, waiting for a kingdom that had told her it no longer needed her kind. I did not know she existed until Werk began to die. Let me tell you how it happened. Let me tell you all of it, because the story deserves its whole length, and because I have spent 6 years regretting the parts I got wrong, and I find that confession, when it is honest, is the only cure I know for pride. Werk came to Ironville 312 years before I was born. He came from the northern ranges, out of the iron-gray peaks where the old wolves still run, the great spirit wolves, those silver creatures half the size of horses, whose eyes burn amber even in full daylight, and whose howl can be heard from one end of a valley to the other. Most packs have a bond wolf, a single, ordinary wolf whose spirit is bound to the alpha's line, a living compass that points toward the fated mate, that steadies the pack in grief, that lies at the feet of the dying king and rises for the new one. Bond wolves are common enough. Every pack worth its salt has one. Werk was not a bond wolf. Werk was something older. The records call him a keep wolf, a creature of the great deep mountain, born only once every few centuries when the moon chooses to pour something of herself into the pack's bloodline. A keep wolf does not bond to the alpha alone. A keep wolf bonds to the keep itself, to the stone and the pack and the memory of everything the hold has ever been, and it requires for that bond to stay whole and living, a keeper, a specific kind of human soul. The records call it the keeper's line, a lineage of men and women, usually humble, always patient, who had a particular gift for the deep language of such creatures. Not a magical gift exactly, more like a tuning. The way a bell only rings at one frequency, and the right finger on the right glass will call it true. For 300 years, Ironville had kept that lineage alive. Generation to generation, the keeper and the great wolf had been the quiet heart of the hold, less visible than the alpha, less celebrated than the warriors, but as necessary as the stone itself. When Werk was well, the pack was well. When the keeper was kind, the keep wolf stayed true. And when Werk was content, settled, present, the bond marks of every mated pair in Ironville burned a little brighter, and the faded connections between souls came a little clearer, a little faster, a little warmer than they did in packs with only ordinary wolves. I did not fully believe any of this when I took the throne. I was 28, newly crowned, and surrounded by a council of sensible men who spoke in quantities and outcomes. They pointed out correctly that the keeper's stipend was a significant line in the treasury. They pointed out less correctly, though it sounded reasonable, that Werk had not responded to a human hand in 40 years, that the previous keeper's apprentice was young and untested, and that in the modern order of things, a wolf who no longer participated in pack life was an expensive ornament. They suggested the keeper's line could be quietly dissolved. The apprentice could be given a modest settlement and a cottage at the edge of the greywood. Werk would live out his years in the eastern courtyard. Nothing would change. Nothing would change. I let them say it, and I nodded, and I signed the decree, and I told myself that I had made a rational decision. That was 6 years ago. It started with the birds. For the first year after the dissolution, Werk lay in the eastern courtyard and watched the sky. He ate when food was brought. He stood when rain came. He was not unkind to the wolves who slept near him. He simply did not acknowledge them. His amber eyes moved over everything with the patience of something very old and very unhurried, and I told myself he was simply aging, the way all creatures age, and that the restlessness I sometimes saw in his gaze was nothing I needed to interpret. In the second year, the birds stopped coming to the eastern courtyard. Not all birds, but the small ones, the wrens and the pale finches that had always nested in the eaves above his sleeping hollow, vanished one morning and did not return. I noticed it the way you notice a picture has been moved. The wrongness registered before the reason did. In the third year, Werk stopped eating. Not entirely at first. He ate enough to live, and the court healer said the wolf was simply slowing, that this was natural in a creature of his age, that there was nothing to be done. I sent the court healer away and called in 3 others from the eastern packs. They examined Werk with care and told me 3 different things, none of which had anything to do with the old records. I sent for the old records in the 4th year. I sat with them for 2 weeks, in the library above the great hall, while outside the window Werk lay still in his courtyard and refused the meat that was brought to him. The records were in 4 different hands, spanning a century and a half. They were not sensational. They did not make grand claims. They described, in the patient, specific language of people who had spent a great deal of time watching and listening, what a keepwolf required to stay well. I had not sat with old records in a long time. My counsel handled the archive. The archive produced summaries. I acted on summaries. I had been governing an entire kingdom through the medium of other people's interpretations, and it had seemed efficient, and I had not questioned it, because efficiency had been my operating principle, and questioning one's operating principles is uncomfortable and time-consuming. So when I sat down with the actual records, with the original ink, the actual observations, the marginal notes and the small corrections, and the ink blots where someone had been startled mid-sentence by a development worth recording immediately, it was something of a revelation. They were alive in a way that summaries are not. They had the texture of people in them. The second keeper's writing slanted left when he was excited and ran almost perfectly horizontal when he was calm. I learned to read his emotional state by the angle of his script before I read his words. The third keeper had a habit of beginning a new paragraph whenever she realized she had been wrong about something, which meant her entries were full of short paragraphs, which I came to understand as a measure of how honestly she was attending. The fourth had written in a clear, upright hand that suggested a mind extremely well organized and slightly impatient with the world's tendency toward muddle, and her observations were the most practically useful of all. But it was the first keeper, the hedge woman from the border, 300 years back, whose writing moved me most. She had written in a hand that showed she had learned letters late and imperfectly, and her spelling was not always certain, and her sentences sometimes ran on far longer than was grammatically defensible. But she had written with a quality of attention that I could feel across 3 centuries. She had been paying absolute, undivided, unhurried attention to the creature before her, and what she had seen and recorded was therefore more complete and more true than anything the more technically accomplished writers had managed, because she had not been attending to her own performance as a writer. She had simply been there. A keep wolf does not love the keeper because the keeper is useful, she had written, in her unsteady hand. It loves the keeper because the keeper is present. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Then I called for the last keeper's apprentice. The steward looked at me blankly. The girl, my lord. We settled her at the Greywood cottage 6 years ago. Go and fetch her. A pause. She may not wish to come, my lord. She was not, the dissolution was not, that is to say, she was not treated poorly, but it was also not. I understand what it was, I said. Go and fetch her, and tell her that Werk is ill and that I am asking, not commanding. Tell her I am asking her to come. It was the first honest thing I had done in 4 years. She did not come for 3 days. I did not send a second messenger. I had asked. She was under no obligation, and something in the way the steward had trailed off "she may not wish to come" told me that demanding her presence would be precisely the wrong move. So I waited. I sat with the records. I learned the name of every keeper in Ironville's history, what they had done and how long they had served, and what had happened in the years when the position had been left unfilled. There had been 2 such gaps in 3 centuries. Both times, the records noted, Werk had gone quiet. Both times, a new keeper had eventually come, and the wolf had recovered. She came on the 4th morning, before dawn, when the eastern courtyard was still silver with pre-light. I was there because I had taken to sitting with Werk in those early hours, though he did not acknowledge me. I had a feeling by then that acknowledgement was not the point, that what he needed was simply presence, and that I owed him mine since I had been so careless with his for so long. I heard the gate before I saw her. It opened quietly, the way people open gates when they have spent years learning to move without disrupting things. She came through with a single small pack over one shoulder and a worn leather satchel at her side, and she stopped just inside the gate and looked at Werk for a long moment without speaking. She was not what I had expected, though I could not have told you what I had expected. She was perhaps 4 or 5 years younger than I was, with the kind of face that does not announce itself, thoughtful, steady, a little guarded, and her dress was plain, the gray-blue of river stone, with a healer's wrap around her wrists and ink stains on 2 of her fingers. She moved as though she had learned to take up exactly as much space as she needed and no more. She did not look at me at first, she looked at Werk. I saw her face change when she saw how still he was, how deeply still, the way an ancient thing goes still when it is deciding whether to remain in the world or to let the world continue without it. Her expression did not break. She did not cry. But something in her went very carefully controlled, the way water goes controlled when you are carrying it across a distance and you cannot afford to spill a drop. I had been expecting, I realized, some version of reproach, some visible evidence of the injury I had done her. I had prepared, in a dim and half-conscious way, to be made to feel the full weight of it immediately upon her arrival as a debt called in. But she did not look at me with reproach. She looked at the wolf, and then she looked at the wolf more carefully, and then her face went through something very quick and very private, grief, I thought, or the shape of it, the recognition of what had been allowed to happen in her absence. And then it settled again into that quality of careful control, and she turned and looked at me. "My lord," she said, no bow, not rudely, she was not a rude woman, but without the reflexive deference of someone trying to make herself smaller. She had been made smaller once by my decree. She was not going to do it to herself a second time. "I am grateful you came," I said. "I came for the wolf," she said, "not for the court." "I know," I said. "That is the right reason." She looked at me for another moment, measuring something, not my rank, I thought, but my sincerity. I held the gaze. I did not look away, and I did not add anything to what I had said, because anything more would have been filling the silence for my own comfort rather than for hers. Then she turned her attention back to Werk, crossed the courtyard at a slow, unhurried pace, and sat down on the flagstones about 6 feet from where he lay. She did not touch him. She did not call to him. She simply sat, with her hands open in her lap and her back straight and her face quiet and breathed. I had not known until that moment that sitting could be a form of work. I had always understood work as action, decision, speech, movement, force applied to problem. What she did was nothing like that, and it was not nothing. It was something very specific and very disciplined, a quality of openness, of available presence, of making herself the kind of thing that a frightened or grieving creature could choose to approach on its own terms and in its own time. It required, I understood slowly, the same thing that good governance requires, a willingness to be uncomfortable, to not fill the silence, to trust that the outcome will be better if you resist the impulse to force it. It required patience with a humility in it. I sat back down on my own stone bench and breathed along with her, because it seemed like the thing to do, and because I had nothing better to offer. The courtyard was very still. The pre-dawn light turned from silver to pale gold, and the first birds returned to the eaves. Only two of them, small and cautious, and Werk's great amber eyes moved, very slowly, toward the woman who had come to sit near him. He did not move, but his eyes moved. I sat very still and did not remark on it, because I had the feeling that remarking on things would be exactly wrong. Her name, I learned, was not a name she offered easily. She told me on the third morning, after we had sat in the courtyard together for 2 silent hours. By then, Werk had shifted his position so that his great head was angled 10 degrees toward her, which the records would later confirm was a significant act of communication for a keepwolf in distress. She had begun to speak to him then, not words I could fully hear, a low, steady murmur that seemed less like language and more like the sound a river makes when it is running over familiar stone. "My name is Saren," she said to me, between sessions with Werk. "Not volunteered exactly. Offered the way you offer something that you have been careful with for a long time and are now deciding to set down for a moment and trust someone else with." I told her my name, which she of course already knew, but I said it anyway, my given name, not my title, because it seemed important to meet the honesty in kind. "I know," she said. "I knew your name before I knew mine." There was not much else to learn about in the Hold's records, and I spent a good deal of time with the Hold's records. What did the records say? That you were a younger son who became the heir at 19 after your brother died, that you were a good enough king, that you were practical, that you dissolved the keeper's line in your 2nd year because the council said it was economical. She paused. They did not say whether you believed them or whether you simply let them decide. I looked at my hands. I let them decide. "I suspected that," she said. "You did not strike me as a cruel man. You struck me as an inattentive one." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in 6 years. I found that I had no argument against it. "I am sorry," I said, "for the dissolution, for the way it was done, for 6 years of silence that I should have broken sooner." She was quiet for a long time. Werk's amber gaze had drifted back toward her, and she turned to look at him in return, and for a moment I had the sensation, not metaphorical, but almost physical, of being the least important presence in the courtyard, which was exactly as it should be. "The wolf does not care about your apology," she said finally. "The wolf cares whether you will let things be put right." "Yes," I said, "whatever it takes, yes." She looked at me again, and this time there was something in her gaze that had moved past the measuring and arrived somewhere quieter. Not forgiveness. I had not earned that yet, but the beginning of a working trust. The kind that says, "All right then, let us see." "Then give me a week," she said, "before you send anyone else into this courtyard. Only you, and only in the early mornings. Everyone else stays out." "Done." "And I need the old records, all of them, not copies, the originals." "I'll have them brought tonight." She nodded and turned back to Werk, and the lesson in contrition was over for the morning. The week she asked for became 12 days. I did not complain. I watched what I was permitted to watch, the early morning hours, and retreated when she asked me to, and had the rest of the day to sit with my own thoughts and the growing, uncomfortable awareness that I had done something deeply wrong, and was only now beginning to understand how deeply. On the 5th day, she began to speak to Werk in the true language of the keepwolves. I heard it from the courtyard gate and stopped walking. I do not have the words to describe what it was, except to say that it was not any language I had ever heard, and it was not music, and it was not quite speech. It was something between the two, low and varied, with a quality of absolute attention in it, the way a hawk holds still before it moves. It had the feeling of a question, and also of a statement, and also of something that did not need to be either of those things because it was simply there, simply true, simply being offered into the air for the creature before her to do with what it would. Werk lifted his head. He had not lifted his head in 3 weeks. I had not seen his head above the level of his sleeping hollow since before I sent for the records. Now he lifted it slowly, with the careful dignity of something very old that is not yet certain whether to trust the moment, and he looked at her. She did not stop speaking. She did not react to the movement. She simply continued, steady and low and true, as though she had never doubted that he would listen. I stood at the gate for a long time and did not go in, because she had not asked me to, and because I was beginning to understand that there are forms of communication that do not require an audience. When I walked away, something in my chest ached in a way I did not know how to name. I thought at first that it was grief, for the years I had wasted, for the decree I had signed, for the 40 years before my reign that Werk had already spent in a kind of slow, patient loneliness. I thought it was remorse. It was not only remorse. I did not understand that yet, but the ache stayed. On the 9th day, she told me Werk's true name. We were sitting together in the early morning, in the new configuration we had fallen into, she closer to the wolf, I on my bench at the courtyard's edge, and Werk was eating. He had begun to eat again on the 7th day, and on the 8th he had stood, and this morning he had moved to within 4 feet of where she sat, close enough that if she had reached out she could have touched his great silver shoulder, though she had not touched him yet. "I should not be telling you this," she said. "Keepers do not share true names outside the line, but you will need to know it if there is ever another time when I am not, if something prevents me from." "Nothing will prevent you from being here," I said. "I will see to that." She looked at me steadily. "That is a large promise for a practical man." "I am trying to become a less practical man," I said. "I am told I was too quick to treat important things as practical questions." She studied me for a moment. Then she told me the name. "I will not write it here, because it belongs to Werk and to her and to the keeper's line, and some things do not belong in records that others might read. But I will say that when she spoke it quietly, almost to herself, turning the syllables over the way you turn a stone in your hand to feel its weight, something in the air of the courtyard changed. Not dramatically, not with light or sound. Simply, the air became more itself. The way a room feels more like a room when someone has opened the windows. And Werk turned his great head and looked directly at me. He had not looked at me, not truly looked, not the way he was looking now, with all his amber attention fixed and full, since I was a child and my father had brought me to the courtyard to meet him. I had forgotten what it felt like. It felt like being recognized, not as a king, as something smaller and more specific and more real than a king. I could not speak. I sat with that gaze for what felt like a very long time, and then Werk turned his head back towards Saren, and the contact broke, and I was just a man sitting on a stone bench in the early morning again. I looked at my left wrist. The mate mark was glowing. Not blazing, not the brilliant ignition I had seen described in the old records, the way a fated mate bond sometimes announced itself with the force of a physical shock. This was quieter, a low, deep gold, the way an ember looks when you've let the fire burn down, and it's showing you its truest color. It was on the inside of my wrist, a pattern I had known all my life. Every Alpha King carries the potential mark, waiting for the mate bond to call it live, and for 28 years it had been only a faint line, no warmer than any other patch of skin. Now it was glowing. I turned my wrist over slowly and looked at it, and I thought, that is what the ache was. I did not tell her that day. I did not tell her the next day either, because I was aware that I was already in the position of a man who owed a great debt, and telling a woman who had just agreed to a tentative working trust that she was his fated mate is a particular kind of pressure that a decent man does not apply from a position of power. The bond had chosen her. That did not mean she had chosen me. Those are two entirely different things, And confusing them is how kings become the kind of kings who make women feel that destiny has trapped them rather than found them. So I said nothing, and I wore long sleeves, and I sat in the early mornings and watched her work. The work was extraordinary to watch. She did not rush it. She did not perform it. She simply brought herself fully, quietly, completely into the courtyard each morning, settled near Werk, and continued the conversation they had apparently been having for 9 years since her apprentice days, before the dissolution cut it off. There was a quality in how she was with the wolf that I could only call devotion. Not the devotion of someone seeking a reward, but the devotion of someone who would do this work whether or not anyone ever acknowledged it, because the work itself was worth doing, and the creature before her was worth loving. I had met very few people in my life who were like that. Actually, I was not sure I had met any. On the 12th day, she touched him. She had been sitting closer each morning, the distance narrowing by inches, and Werk had been angling toward her by the same slow gradation, so that by the 12th morning they were perhaps 18 inches apart, and the whole courtyard had the feeling of a sentence approaching its last word. She raised her right hand slowly, no sudden movement, no announcement, and laid her palm against the great wolf's silver shoulder. Werk closed his eyes. He made no sound. He simply closed his great amber eyes and was still, and under her hand I could see the long, slow rise and fall of his breathing, slow further, and slow again, until it had the depth and calm of something sleeping fully and safely for the first time in years. His enormous tail moved once. Not a wag, something too slow and too dignified for a wag. A single sweep, like a flag acknowledging a wind it trusts. Saren's face was very still, but I could see from where I sat that her eyes were bright. She breathed his name then, his true name, not the use name, the deep syllable she had taught me, and she said it so quietly that I could barely hear it from across the courtyard, but I felt it, the way you feel a bell struck somewhere below the range of ordinary hearing, a resonance that passes through the chest rather than the ears. Werk opened his eyes and looked at her. Then he lowered his great head and pressed his brow to her hand. 312 years of distance and silence, and he pressed his brow to her hand, and the courtyard was entirely still, and I sat on my bench with my left wrist burning gold beneath my sleeve, and understood that I was watching something sacred, and that I was very lucky to be allowed to watch it. Then she wept. Not loudly, she was not a loud woman. She wept with her hand against Werk's brow and her head slightly bowed, and the tears came in the quiet, relieved way that tears come when something you have been holding for a very long time is finally allowed to be set down. She had spent 6 years in a cottage at the edge of the Greywood, tending records no one asked her to tend, speaking into the empty air in the hope that somehow, across the distance, the wolf could still hear. She had held that faithfulness alone and without reward, and it had cost her something. Not everything. She was not a broken woman, not even close, but something real and patient and quietly painful, and now the weight of it was leaving her, and she let it go. Werk held still against her hand and let her weep. I did not go to her. I sat on my bench and looked at my hands because that moment did not belong to me, and I knew it. There are gifts that a king can give and gifts that he cannot, and the one being given in that courtyard was not mine to participate in. It was hers. It had always been hers. But later, when she had composed herself and Werk was sleeping soundly for the first time in 3 years, and she had come to sit on the bench beside me with the worn leather satchel at her feet, and her face washed clean and tired and at peace, I pushed up my left sleeve and turned my wrist over. She looked at the glowing mark. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. "How long?" she asked. "Since the 9th day. When you spoke his name." She was quiet for another moment. "That was when I first fully trusted you," she said slowly. I was not sure before that whether you were sincere. When you said you would see to it that nothing kept me from being here, I thought you meant it, and I was afraid to believe that I thought you meant it. I did mean it, I said. I know, she looked at the mark again. I know now. I did not press. I did not declare. I simply sat with my wrist turned upward in the morning light and let the silence be what it was, an open question, without demand, without urgency, without any of the weight of rank or obligation or destiny as pressure. The bond had chosen, but the choice was hers. It does not compel you, I said. I want you to know that. Whatever it feels, it does not ask you to decide anything today or tomorrow. There is no timeline here except the one you name. She looked at me. The guarded quality in her expression had not entirely left. It would take more than 12 days and one honest morning to undo 6 years of quiet exile. But underneath it, there was something else now. Something considering. Something that was not quite warmth but was the shape of warmth. The way a room holds the memory of heat after the fire has burned down. I know what the mark means, she said. I have read every record. I know what a fated bond is and how it works. A pause. I also know that fated bonds have been used as excuses for pressure before. Yes, I said, they have. And I will not be one of those stories. She studied me for a long moment. The morning light was full now, the courtyard golden, and Werk slept behind her with the slow, enormous peace of something finally, mercifully at rest. Ask me again, she said, in a month, when I have had time to know you better than the records say, and when you have had time to show me that the king you are now is different from the king who signed that decree. A month, I said, yes. And in the meantime, she said, I would like to have the keeper's position restored, formally, with the stipend and the title and the access to the records, not for me, for Werk. He should not go through another regency uncertainty, without the position being clear in the law. I'll have the decree drafted today, I said, and I will sign it myself before the full council, so there is no question about its authority. She looked at me one more time with that measuring quality, and then something in her settled. Not all the way, not finally, but settled in the provisional way of someone who is still watching, still learning, still reserving judgment, but who has decided to keep the door open a little longer. All right, she said, a month then. The council was not pleased. I had not expected them to be pleased, and I had not asked them to be, which was a marked change from my approach 6 years prior. I told them in flat declarative terms that the keeper's position was being restored, that the dissolution decree was being struck from the records, and that the woman I was restoring to that position would have full access to the hold and all materials pertaining to Werk's care. I told them her name. I told them that Werk was eating and standing and had accepted her presence, and that the 3 court healers who had said there was nothing to be done had been wrong, and that this was a lesson worth attending to. Master Aldrich, who had been on the council since my father's time and had authored the original dissolution recommendation, cleared his throat. My lord, the position was dissolved for practical reasons. The cost alone is less than the cost of losing Werk, I said. Do the accounting yourself. What does the Pax bond health decline cost us in faded connections delayed or missed, in the slow dimming of the Pax instinct, in 3 years of a keepwolf who would not eat? I looked at him steadily. The practical reasons were a story I was told because the true reasons are difficult to quantify. They are not therefore less real. A silence. Several council members looked at Aldrich. He looked at the table. You relied on your assessment, Master Aldrich, I said. I relied on it too readily. That is 2 errors, not 1, and I own mine, but I will not compound mine further by letting it stand. He looked up at me, and I saw in his face something I had not expected, not anger, but a kind of chagrined recognition. He was a man who had spent 40 years being useful to the throne, and who had, in this matter, been wrong, and I thought perhaps he had known it for some time, and had been hoping no one would make him say so directly. The position will be restored, I said again, and I would like to hear no further argument about the cost. I waited, no argument came. Furthermore, I said, I am naming the keeper to the Hold's Record Council. The old records are to be preserved and catalogued in their original form. No more copies filed in the supplemental archive, and the originals left to damp in the lower stacks. More silence. Aldrich's jaw moved, but he did not speak. I am also changing the process by which the council reviews the dissolution of any position tied to Werk's care, or to the old lineages, or to any aspect of the Hold's bond health. Those decisions will require a full record vote rather than a chairman's recommendation. I should have required that 6 years ago. I am requiring it now. Aldrich looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, with the stiff dignity of a man performing a thing he would rather not perform but knows he must, "My lord, I believe that is wise." And then he sat back and folded his hands and said nothing more. It was, I thought, a form of courage, not the dramatic kind. The everyday kind, the kind that admits error in a council chamber at a table where you have sat for 40 years. And I respected it more than I would have expected to. Are there other questions? There were no other questions. The month passed. I do not have words adequate to describe a month of slowly becoming someone worth knowing. I had governed a kingdom for 6 years. I knew how to hold meetings and sign decrees and read maps and make decisions. I did not, as it turned out, know how to sit in a courtyard in the early morning and talk to a woman who had earned the right to say plainly what she thought of me, and to hear what she said and not defend myself, but simply take it in and let it instruct me. She taught me more in that month than 6 years on the throne had. She taught me what the old records actually said, as opposed to what my council had summarized them as saying. She taught me the names of the 4 previous keepers and what each had contributed, and what had been lost when the line was interrupted. The first keeper, 3 centuries back, had been a hedge woman from the border settlements. No title, no standing, simply a particular quality of attention that Werk had recognized and followed back to the Hold like a creature following a sound only it could hear. The second had been a boy of 15, a wolf's son from a minor pack, who had spent 40 years in the position, and in whom the records were most detailed, because he had been a meticulous writer, and had left behind 7 volumes of observations about Werk's behavior, the old language, and the nature of the keep-wolf bond. The third and fourth had been women, the third with a gift for the true language so precise that she had added 3 new syllables to the existing record of Werk's name, refinements so subtle that the previous keepers had not found them. The fourth, who had served until just before my father's time, had been the one to establish the formal apprentice system, believing that the line should not depend on fortunate chance but on deliberate cultivation. "That was her," Saren said one morning of the 4th. "My master's master. She is why the apprentice system existed. She is why I was trained at all." A pause. "And then we dissolved it." I did not look away from her when she said that. I held the weight of it. She taught me, with patience and without cruelty, that practical efficiency and wisdom are not the same thing, and that a king who cannot distinguish between them will eventually mistake the map for the territory and walk off a cliff. She taught me to read the old records not for their conclusions but for their method. The way the keepers had written down not what Werk did, but what they were noticing and what questions they were asking, and what they still did not understand, which was its own kind of honesty, a kind I had not encountered much in council chambers. She also taught me things she did not intend to teach me, or perhaps she intended them, and was simply patient enough to wait for me to receive them. She taught me, for instance, what it looked like when someone worked without an audience. I had grown up in a court, where most labor is performed with some awareness of the watchers, where even genuine effort has a slight orientation toward display, a consciousness of the impression being made. Saren had none of that. When she was with Werk, she was simply with Werk. When she read the records, she was simply reading. When she wrote her annotations, she wrote them for the record, not for any future reader who might admire her scholarship. There was something in this that was profoundly instructive to me, and also, I found, profoundly restful to be with someone who was not performing, who did not require me to perform, who was simply present in whatever the task was and invited, by her example, a similar presence. I was not a natural student of this. I had spent 6 years being the most important person in every room, which is a habit of attention that does not easily unbend. But she was a patient teacher, and I was, for once in my life, genuinely motivated, and the courtyard's early morning hours became, over that month, the thing I looked forward to most in the day. She also, and this I had not anticipated, made me laugh. Not often. She was not a performing woman, not a woman who turned herself charming for the benefit of a room. But she had a particular dry, careful precision in how she observed things, and occasionally she would say something so exactly true and exactly unexpected that I would laugh before I had time to stop myself, and she would look faintly satisfied, the way someone looks when they have thrown a stone and hit the precise target they were aiming at. One morning I arrived in the courtyard to find her reading a record about the second keeper, the meticulous boy of 15 who had become a man of 55 and written 7 volumes, and she looked up and said, without preamble, "He wrote 43 consecutive pages about the way Werk's left ear moves when he is thinking. I counted. 43 pages. I believe he may have loved that wolf more than he loved any person he ever met." "Is that a problem?" I asked. "No," she said, with that perfectly calibrated dryness. "It simply makes me feel that all my own attachment to him is quite modest by comparison." I laughed. Werk, without opening his eyes, twitched the ear in question, and Saren looked at the wolf with such exact, warm, affectionate exasperation that I thought my chest might not contain everything that was in it. I was keeping close track of what was in my chest by then, mostly because there was so much of it and it was growing. Werk, meanwhile, grew stronger. By the 3rd week of the month, he was standing each morning when she arrived, great head up, ears forward, tail moving in that slow, dignified sweep that I had come to recognize as his version of a greeting. By the 4th week, he was eating full meals and had resumed his habit of walking the eastern courtyard's perimeter at dawn. Something, the old records noted, that keep wolves do when their bond is stable and they are satisfied with their hold's condition. The second keeper had written extensively about these perimeter walks, noting that the direction Werk chose and the pace he kept were meaningful, that a clockwise walk at a slow pace meant the bond was stable and the keeper was well, and that a counterclockwise walk at any pace meant something in the hold needed attention. In the month of Saren's return, he walked clockwise every morning, slowly, with the unhurried contentment of something that has been given back what it required, and is in no danger of losing it again. The 2 small birds returned to the eaves. Then more birds. Then, one afternoon, I came to find the courtyard and found it full of them. Wrens and finches and one astonishing large white-winged bird I could not name, all sitting calmly around Saren's feet while she read a record aloud and Werk lay beside her with his great chin on his foreleg and his eyes half closed. I stood at the gate and looked at this scene for a long time. I had run a kingdom for 6 years and done it competently, and I had never once been as certain of anything as I was certain, standing at that gate, that the woman in the courtyard was the best thing in it, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the particular way that people are beautiful who are fully and consistently themselves, but because she was true, all the way through. True in the way she attended to Werk, true in the way she spoke to me, true in the way she had spent 6 years in exile tending a post no one had asked her to keep because it was hers, and she was not going to abandon it merely because the world had decided it was no longer needed. The mate bond on my wrist burned warm and steady, the way a hearth burns when it is well fed and well tended. It did not need to announce itself, it simply was. I asked her on the last day of the month. We were in the courtyard at the usual hour, Werk alert and bright-eyed beside her, the morning light the particular thin gold of early autumn. She had the old records spread across her lap, and she was annotating them in the careful, close handwriting I had come to recognize as hers, and she looked entirely settled, the way people look in places they have decided are home. "A month," I said. She looked up. She had known it was the last day. She was too careful a woman not to have counted. "A month," she agreed. I sat for a moment, choosing words with the same care I had been trying to give to everything in the past 30 days. "I will not tell you that the bond has decided for you. I will not tell you that destiny asks. I will not use any of the old arguments that kings have used when they wanted to make their wanting sound like the universe's wanting." I looked at her steadily. "I will tell you that I have spent a month learning who you are, and what I have learned is that you are the most honest and the most patient and the most genuinely courageous person I have encountered in 6 years of ruling a kingdom, and that I would like, very much, and of my own will, separate from any mark or bond or record, to keep knowing you, if you would allow it." She looked at me for a long time. Werk, beside her, lifted his head and watched us both with his amber eyes, with the patience of something that has already understood what is about to happen and is simply waiting for the slower creatures to catch up. "You said that well," she said. "I've been practicing." "I know," she said. "I noticed." A pause. The birds moved in the eaves. Werk's tail swept once. "The mark on your wrist," she said slowly. "I should tell you it is not entirely one-directional. I have been aware of the bond since earlier than I told you. Since the 6th morning when you stayed at the gate and did not come in because I had not asked you to. I thought a king would come in anyway. You did not." She looked at her own hands. "That was when I began to believe that you might be a man worth knowing." Something in my chest turned over, slow and certain and warm. "Will you stay?" I asked. "Not because of the position, not because of the mark. Will you stay because you choose to?" She looked at Werk. Werk looked back at her. Whatever passed between them in that look was their own, and I would not presume to translate it. But after a moment she set her hand on his great silver brow, and he closed his eyes, and she said something to him very quietly in the old language, and he exhaled, long and slow and entirely content. Then she turned back to me. "Yes," she said, "I choose to. There is a thing I should tell you about the council, and about Master Aldrich, and about how the court was informed. I had not planned a ceremony. Saren was not, I thought, a woman who would want the announcement made into a performance. She had spent years being quietly excellent without any audience, and she had not seemed to find the lack of audience a hardship. So I thought we would tell the council simply, in a meeting room with the formal record, and that would be that. Werk had other ideas. On the morning I was due to inform the council, Saren came through the eastern gate as she always did, and Werk rose. He did not simply stand, as he had been standing for weeks. He rose to his full height, which was taller than I remembered, or perhaps he had been smaller in those long months of fading. He rose to his full height and he moved to stand beside her, not behind her, not before her, but beside her, his great silver shoulder at the level of her own, his amber eyes steady and forward-facing. And then, slowly and entirely deliberately, Werk turned his head toward the hold's main courtyard, the great northern courtyard where the whole pack assembled on ritual mornings, and he walked toward it. He had not gone to the main courtyard in 3 years. In 3 years, no one had seen him there. Saren looked at me, I looked at her, then we followed. The pack was there, not assembled for any reason, simply gathered the way packs gather in the morning at work at talk, moving through their day. When Werk walked in, everything stopped. Every head turned. Every wolf, standing or moving or mid-sentence, went entirely still, and the courtyard held a silence so complete that I could hear the birds in the eaves 2 wings away. Werk walked to the center of the courtyard, with Saren at his shoulder, and he stopped. He looked at the pack. Then, in a movement so deliberate it could not be anything but intentional, he lowered his great head until his brow nearly touched the flagstones. Not all the way, not the full bow a wolf gives to a pack elder, but a deep, unmistakable inclination, the gesture the records call the recognition bow, the thing a keep wolf gives only to the soul it has claimed as central to its hold. And he held it there before the entire assembled pack for the space of 3 full breaths. Then he raised his head and stood straight and still, with Saren at his shoulder, and looked at every face in that courtyard. The pack looked back. And then, one by one, not because I commanded them, not because any protocol required it, they bowed. The warriors first, then the elders, then the younger wolves, and then, last and rather stiffly, Master Aldrich, who looked as though the bow was costing him something but was paying it anyway, which was more than I had expected from him, and which I resolved to acknowledge when the moment was past. The council's objections, I found, dissolved rather quickly after that. There is something about a 300-year-old keep wolf deciding, publicly and before the entire hold, that a woman is central to the life of the pack. That has a clarifying effect on practical arguments. I stood beside Saren in the center of the courtyard, with Werk's great silver bulk warm at our backs and the pack bowed before us, and I felt, for the first time in 6 years, that I was exactly where my decisions had brought me, and that I was glad of it. Not the early decisions, not the decree, not the dissolution, not the 6 years of inattention. Those I would carry as what they were, mistakes that had cost someone who deserved better a great deal of patience and quiet pain. That weight does not go away. A decent man does not ask it to. But the later decisions, the records, the messenger, the asking instead of commanding, the month of sitting in the courtyard and listening, those I was glad of. Those were the decisions that had brought me here. Those were the ones that had, slowly and imperfectly, and with more stumbling than I would like to admit, made me into someone worth the choice she had made. I looked at her. She was watching the pack with a quiet, composed expression, but her eyes were bright again in that way they had been when Werk first laid his head against her hand. The tears held back this time, not from sorrow, but from something too full to contain. She had worked for this. She had waited for this, through 6 years of exile and silence and records tended in an empty cottage. And now the hold's great wolf stood at her shoulder and the pack bowed, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. She turned and found me watching her, and something in her face moved, not surprise, not embarrassment, simply a kind of recognition, the look of someone who is being truly seen and has decided to let themselves be seen. Was this Werk's idea? She asked quietly. Entirely, I said. He has always known better than either of us, she said. He has, I agreed. I am trying to catch up. We were formally bonded in the hold's great hall at the turning of autumn, in the old ceremony the records described, and that no one had performed in several generations. Not the council's version, the modernized one they had substituted, which was efficient and legally clear, and contained not one syllable of the old language. The original ceremony. Saren translated it herself from the oldest records in her careful, close handwriting, and she presented me the translation 3 days before so that I could learn my portion. I practiced it in the library, alone, with rather more effort than I had applied to any decree in my 6 years of reign, and I was not fully satisfied with my pronunciation on the morning of the ceremony and said so. And she told me, with that dry, careful precision I had come to love, that the old language was not a performance, and that Werk, who would be listening more closely than any wolf present, cared far more about the intention than the accent. Is that true? I asked, or are you simply being kind? Both, she said, but mostly true. She read her portion in the old tongue and I read mine, and Werk stood at the hall's center with his amber eyes forward and his great head high, and the bond marks on both our wrists blazed gold together, not sequentially, not one following the other, but simultaneously, as though the same current had passed through both of us at the moment our voices completed the old words together. And the hall was full of wolves who had watched the keep wolf return to himself, and knew what that meant and were glad. Master Aldrich, I should note, was in the front row and bowed with everyone else, and I chose to interpret this as growth rather than as capitulation, which is the most generous reading and probably the correct one. Saren stood beside me in the hall's gold light, in a dress the color of deep water, with ink on 2 of her fingers because she had been annotating records until an hour before the ceremony and had not quite managed to wash it off entirely. I noticed it and said nothing, and thought of it as a perfect detail, of a woman who does not stop being herself for the occasion, who does not perform a softer or more ceremonial version of who she is, who simply arrives as she is and trusts that who she is will be enough. It was more than enough. It had always been more than enough. The hold had simply not been paying attention. I had a great deal to learn from that, and I intended to spend the rest of my reign learning it. There is one more thing. On the morning after the bonding ceremony, I found Saren in the eastern courtyard at the usual hour, before dawn, sitting with Werk. I had come to join her, as I always did now. The early morning hours had become mine in a way that the rest of the day was not, the quiet before the hold woke, the low light and the birds and the great wolf and the woman who made sense of all of it. She was reading again. The old records, a new volume, she had begun cataloging them by era, and she was working through the 3rd century, which had the most complete accounts of Werk's middle years. She had a blanket over her knees against the autumn chill, and a cup of something warm that steamed in the cool air, and Werk's great head was resting beside her, with the settled, contented weight of something that had found its place. I sat down beside her, and she handed me the cup without looking up, and I drank from it and handed it back, and we sat in the comfortable, wordless ease of people who have stopped performing for each other. After a while she said, "There is a record here from the 2nd century. The keeper at the time wrote something I have been thinking about." "What did she write?" Saren was quiet for a moment, finding the passage. Then she read it. "A keep wolf does not love the keeper because the keeper is useful. It loves the keeper because the keeper is present. Presence is the rarest form of care. Most powerful people have never learned it. They have learned to act and to decide and to command, all of which are necessary and none of which are sufficient. The keep wolf knows the difference. It has always known. It simply waits." I sat with that for a long time. "She writes it as though she is talking about the wolf," I said. "She is talking about the wolf," Saren said, "and not only about the wolf." Werk exhaled long and slow, the way he did when things were as they should be. The birds moved in the eaves. The courtyard filled with the first thin gold of morning. I was present. I intended to remain so. That seemed at last like the right place to begin.